was born in Wellesley Hospital, and my dad was at that time a bank manager in New Toronto. And then when I was 3, he was transferred to Streetsville. We moved to Streetsville when I was 3, and this was very early on. I lived in a house on the main street, Queen Street, and I remember getting a red trike, a little red bike, and I was so thrilled. But my parents wouldn't let me ride it very far because there were no sidewalks on that street. But anyways, I loved that red trike. So that's my earliest memory. I can't remember much more about that period of my life. I stayed there a long time. I went to public school there and started high school there. And it was a small town. There was even horse and buggy. Wow. In some of the farms nearby. They would come to town, get their groceries and so on. It's a small and I remember living in Streetsville when the train station was right behind our property, and the new modern trains were coming, and people could commute to the city to go to work. That was quite an event when the train took people to the city, and of course it's still happening. Then when I was in high school, my dad was transferred to Haileybury, and that was a long way for us to go from Streetsville. When my dad heard about the location of his transfer, he put a map of Ontario on the floor of the living room, and my mother looked at it. Highway number 11 goes up, and we hadn't come to Haileybury. It was right off the bat. She was so, where are we moving to? And it was off the map. It was north of North Bay, up to North Bay, and stayed in the hotel in North Bay for a few days till we got a house. And we had a lot of laughs just because it was so unique for us to be going to the north. Then we had to go to a temporary school, mining school, for the next few years. And I had a good education in Haileybury. I liked the school, I liked the people, and of course the snow was a challenge for us. The car had to be put away in the winter because there were no snow tires, there was no car.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, the car was put up on blocks for the winter. And
then how did you get around in the winter?
Well, we walked, and it walked a long way, yeah. Yes. And my dad went out and bought a fur hat and a fur coat. For everybody had fur coats. They weren't that expensive, I guess, because that was the only way. We had to go to the other school, and got to know your dad, who I thought was pretty terrific. And he had a girlfriend at the time. But eventually that broke up, right?
Won him over.
That romance broke up, and we started dating just before he went away to university in Toronto. And I had planned to go to University of Toronto as well. So we dated for a couple of months before he moved back down to university, and the romance grew in Toronto. And eventually we both went to university. He graduated in law, and I graduated with a BA and went to Teachers College, and we married. In Toronto, in the University of Toronto. We were married in Emmanuel College on University Avenue, just across from where I lived at Wymawood on the campus. Those were good years after the war. We were very fortunate. I was teaching, so I had an income and supported your dad while he finished Osgoode. He had 8 years in those days, so it was a long, long time. 4 years at university and 4 years at Osgoode. And for 2 years I was working and supporting him, and then I said, after that, you can support me. So the time I retired and had a family. By then we had moved up to Willowdale, and because he had an income and I was teaching at the time, we were able to borrow some money from my dad and buy a house. And then we started a family. 1955, our first child was born. And after she was a year and a half, we bought a house in Toronto. Sold our story and a half and house in Willowdale and bought a nice 2-story house on Sherwood Avenue in Toronto. As I say, times were good. We were optimistic and very confident in those years. 50s were good years. And that's where Jordan, your dad, was born. And Aunt Allison was born. When the house became really crowded, we moved down to Bennington Heights and bought our family home where we stayed for 31 years. Now I should talk about my family background. My mother's family came from the British Islands, and my dad's family came from Jersey Island. I don't know the dates exactly, but in the 1800s, my grandfather, my dad's father, left Jersey Island as a missionary with the Scottish church, Methodist church it must have been, and came to Canada, and it was a French-speaking person, so he was sent to Quebec and worked in the ministry in Quebec for several months. And then at a conference in Montreal, he met my grandmother. My grandmother, who became a Salvation Army lady, told me a story one day about arriving in Canada by ship and walking up from the Toronto waterfront up Yonge Street. Well, she was about 12, and they had an oxen wagon bringing all their belongings all the way to Newmarket because her uncle had a business in saddle making, I think it was, something like that, in Newmarket. So they were joining the uncle in this business. I was talking about Grandpa Jordan, whom I will follow on because he had an interesting life as he came as a young missionary, and he studied very hard in English, his second language, to become a minister. And he finally became an ordained minister in the Methodist Church. And he would have several little missions, or parishes, I guess they call them, in the Methodist Church. And he'd go around to start a church here, or to marry people there, or to bury people.
Wow.
And on horseback.
On horseback. Wow.
With the saddlebag on the horse, with the Bible in the saddlebag. We would drive up Yonge Street. My dad would say, "There's the house where I grew up," and so did Lester Pearson.
Oh.
Lester Pearson was the Prime Minister in those years that we were very proud of. And he'd say, "Lester Pearson and I lived in that house." And because Lester Pearson lived in that manse, there's a building at the Newtonbrook United Church named the Pearson Building. It's a community center and low-cost housing.
Okay.
That they've named after Lester Pearson. That's on